I am Tarun Basu, and I am speaking on South Asia Monitor with my colleague Commodore Uday Bhaskar, a reputed security and strategic analyst. And we are going to try and give an insight into the recent volatile events in South Asia, which perhaps for the first time since 1999 really brought the war home to the people, both in India and in Pakistan. The, the latest events happened almost suddenly and without notice, as these events sometimes often happen. On the 22nd of April, when uh, about 24 exact to be exact, 24 tourists who had been enjoying themselves in a picturesque meadow in Pelgam in Jammu and Kashmir were in a unprovoked and a barbaric manner gunned down by Islamist terrorists after they were identified on the basis of their religion. All, all except one were Indians and one was a Nepali. The incident, the attack, saw the imprint of India, saw the imprint of Pakistan-based attackers, which of course Islamabad, as is its wont, denied. Then began a series of diplomatic tit for tats. India downgraded diplomatic ties, which were anyway without their ambassadors in both countries, and suspended the crucial Indus Water Treaty, which had been there since 1960. And India also cancelled visas for Pakistanis, and all Pakistanis were asked to go back to their countries, which created a bit of a humanitarian issue. And overflights were cancelled, and then began a series of exchange of small arms fire, which was started by Pakistan. And the UN asked both countries to exercise restraint, but that never happened. According to India, Pakistan violated ceasefire for the first time for the fifth consecutive night on April 30, before the US tried to step in for the first time, calling for an effort to diffuse the crisis. India on 3rd May suspended all mails from Pakistan through air and surface routes and banned direct and indirect imports of goods from Pakistan and also docking of Pakistan flagged ships. The real action began on May 7 when a pre-dawn exercise India carried out Operation Sindu, striking 9 sites linked to terror infrastructure in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir and for the first time outside Kashmir, Pakistan-occupied Kashmir in Punjab. Soon after, Pakistan started shelling across the LOC, killing at least 20 people. And then began a dangerous escalation of the war, with a war-like situation. Nobody called it a war. And then just escalation of the war-like situation, which seemed to be spiraling out of control before a dramatic ceasefire announcement by US President Donald Trump, who till then was seeking to keep his hands off the whole issue and even called it a shame. He announced on his social media, Truth Social, that the two sides had agreed to a ceasefire. There was an announcement by Pakistan after that, and then India followed suit. There was the ceasefire seemed to be very fragile in the beginning. There were India said lots of violations. There were exchange of fire across the LOC for several hours. Before, I think, by 11 p.m., the guns fell silent and the ceasefire seems to hold up to now. First question, Uday, naturally is, will the ceasefire hold? This is something people in India and Pakistan and not just all over South Asia, but the world must be asking.
My sense, Tarun, is that as of now, the ceasefire will hold, but in an uneasy manner. Because if you look at the sequence of events, and you had just pointed out, there were some unusual developments, meaning that till it happened, it seemed as if this spiral of violence was going to escalate. Because the ceasefire was announced on Saturday. And earlier that morning, in India, there was a lot of anger that 3 cities had been targeted. There was Jammu, there was Udhampur, there was Srinagar. And particularly because a temple complex in Jammu had been targeted, you could see the kind of social anger and anguish saying that Pakistan has crossed certain lines. So given that backdrop, I would say that yes, the ceasefire will hold, but in an uneasy manner. And in the event there is any kind of provocation, either deliberately or some kind of an accidental trigger, because this LOC has now become very, very live in terms of the deployment of troops and the ammunition and all the other assets that have been brought together. And we still do not know the entire track record. I'm trying to think of how best to describe this in terms of the battle damage, meaning that the intensity of the violence, the kind of platforms that were used, including aircraft. There have been reports that both sides had shot down the aircraft and drones of the other side. But obviously, neither side will acknowledge or confirm in the early days. So we need to get a sense of that. So fingers crossed, I hope this will hold and that there would be some movement towards the beginning of a dialogue. Because unless India and Pakistan sit down, perhaps even go back to the framework of 1972 and Shimla, in the spirit of Shimla, and say that both sides will sit down, I think we will still have this problem on our hands.
Talking about dialogue, let's go back a little bit to yesterday, to the curious way the ceasefire was announced. First, it was not India and Pakistan, but it was announced by President Donald Trump on his social media, followed by Pakistan, and then there was the announcement by the Foreign Secretary in the evening briefing. And the U.S. Secretary of State Mark Rubio, who is also the National Security Advisor, he had been speaking apparently the whole night to the leaders of both sides, including the Pakistan military chief. And he has talked about that whereas India, US is offering its good offices for a resumption of some kind of resumption of dialogue, or not, I should not say resumption, for a face-to-face meeting between India and Pakistan at a neutral place. Now, isn't this jumping the gun a little bit? I mean, India has said that nothing like that has been agreed upon, and they'll wait and see. And Pakistan has thanked the US for their mediation, as it has thanked Saudi Arabia and other countries, while India has said that, insisted, true to the spirit of the Shimla Agreement, which just talks about keeping the things to the bilateral level, that the ceasefire thing happened on a purely bilateral basis after the call by the Pakistan DGMO in the evening. So what exactly was the chain of events?
As you have pointed out, there are two kind of strands that are in the public domain. And in a way, they are part of a strategy that Pakistan has followed going back to October 1947, when the contestation for Kashmir begins. And which is, Pakistan constantly tries to, quote unquote, internationalize the Kashmir issue. And India has, after 1972 and the Shimla Agreement, been very firm that this has to be addressed in the bilateral framework. So after the Pelgam terror attack, I think one must acknowledge or accept that Pakistan has been reasonably successful in drawing international attention again to the Kashmir issue, and by also waving the nuclear card. So the very fact that the US Vice President initially made remarks that the US was not interested, this is not their fight, and India and Pakistan would have to sort it out between themselves. 24 hours later, you saw there was a complete U-turn, and the US Secretary of State, who, as you rightly pointed out, is also the NSA, he's wearing two hats, had picked up the phone, and from what the US press statements and the readout, as they call it, of telephone conversations with leaders are concerned, State Department has a readout, they said that there were extended midnight calls with both leaders in both countries. So therefore, this is in the public domain from the US side, so clearly the US has got involved. But India does not want this kind of mediation. This is a word India doesn't accept. And therefore, the Foreign Secretary has repeatedly said that it was the Pakistani DGMO who called. and India agreed to the cessation of hostilities and the ceasefire. But no, there is no commitment or talk about a dialogue in a neutral venue. So that again would be unusual, a departure from Shimla. So at the moment, I think both sides are in a way trying to advance their own narrative on this, which is why I was saying that not only is the ceasefire a bit uneasy, fragile, but what happens later in terms of the dialogue also leaves a lot of question marks. And this is, again, you can link it back to the very unusual sequence of events that the very dramatic announcement comes from a social media post by the US president. I gather off the record that even in the United States, they were taken aback. Normally, the State Department would have put out something in a very anodyne manner or asked India and Pakistan to put out something simultaneously. There would be some kind of a formal way of doing it. But here you have the US president putting out a personal tweet, and then everyone scrambles after that. So I think we'll have to take it a day at a time.
Talking about the last few days and the near war situation, both are claiming victory in many ways. India has said it has decimated terrorist infrastructure, not just in POK, but also in Punjab, and hit targets that they said were headquarters of the LET and the Jaish-e-Mohammed, and killed at least, the latest report, at least 130 militants and terrorists. And Pakistan has denied a lot of this. And in fact, India has been saying from the beginning that it has been trying to keep the war limited to assault on terror. But Pakistan escalated the situation a day later and apparently hit and targeted cities here, more than a dozen cities, if not more, and even hit military facilities, which saw retaliation by India. And it hit their military infrastructure in Lahore, Rawalpindi, and other places. And reports where the air defense systems has been destroyed, etc. Now, both sides naturally are claiming victory, which is possibly good in a way. But how do you see the so-called war situation or the near war? How did it pan out from the military point of view?
I think first of all, we should acknowledge that this is a conflict which was not formally declared as a war, but it led to the loss of lives. It began with the murder, the massacre of the tourists. 26 of them were killed on April 22nd. And now media reports that are reasonably credible from both sides, the account tally seems to be over 60 people have been killed. This is what I have seen. Maybe it will be refined and we'll have better data about the number of people who've been killed and injured. But this is high. It's not an insignificant number. Over a period of less than a week, to have 60 people dying would suggest that this is a conflict that has acquired a certain level of intensity and loss of life. That is the first. We still do not have a total assessment about the destruction that has been caused to infrastructure. It will come through very soon, I'm sure. Houses have been destroyed, other infrastructure. We had a government official in the state government in Jammu Kashmir who lost his life. There will be others, I'm sure, on the other side of the border also.
When the bodies come home, we'll have a better idea of what actually happened.
And then we'll also have to look at the platforms that may have been degraded or destroyed. For instance, aircraft, drones, and so on and so forth. So therefore, this particular level of military contestation or military hostilities between the two countries points to the equivalent of a new normal, meaning that it's going to be ugly, but the informal kind of understanding now, India has not declared it in a formal sense, but they have said that the next time there is an act of terror from across the border, India would consider that to be an act of war and take whatever steps it deems appropriate. And it has demonstrated that it can acquire and identify targets like in Punjab, like you pointed out, Muridke and Bahawalpur. Now, since South Asia Monitor, as a platform does encourage young citizens of South Asia to be aware of their own region, I think if you allow me, I'd like to draw attention to this fact that when we talk about places like Muridke and Bahawalpur, they have been nurseries of the terror cadres. And this has been documented exhaustively, not just by Indian analysts and academics, but also by Pakistani academics and by the foreign community that looks at the region. And I want to also mention the tragic case of a well-known journalist of the Wall Street Journal, Daniel Pearl. He was killed in February of 2002. And this came soon after 9/11. And in a way, it sensitized and made the US media in particular, because Daniel Pearl was a very well regarded and much loved journalist of the United States. He was operating out of Bombay. He'd just been posted there. And some of us had met him also. And after that, I think the way in which that case was pursued by his own parents and his colleagues has made the West aware of the scourge of terrorism. India had identified those targets. So for me, as an analyst who's been studying this case, these subjects for many decades almost as a student, I think there is a new normal now where India will see this as an act of war. It will take whatever action it deems appropriate, like Operation Sindu. And the Pakistani army will not sever its ties with the terror groups. And we saw that after India's strike, the people who were killed, they were acknowledged as terrorists globally by the UN. But their bodies were draped in the Pakistani flag. And they were escorted by the Pakistani military, which is why one of the things I would like to suggest also that we should perhaps consider is that maybe calling them non-state actors is no longer valid. They are state proxies. And the Pakistani military in Rawalpindi, the ISI, etc., will not sever their links with these groups. India has said it will not let any act of terror go unpunished. So this is the new normal. And Pakistan has demonstrated that they can also strike Indian cities, as far as you rightly pointed out. Simultaneously, they were able to launch their own platforms from Gujarat to Srinagar over one night. So they also have a certain capability. So we have to be prepared for this. And one hopes that civilians are not deliberately targeted, which has not happened in South Asia in previous wars.
You talked about India changing the terms of engagement and saying that in future, any terror attack would be called an act of war by India, seen as an act of war. India has been with Pakistan continuing its policy of using terror, cross-border terror, as part of its foreign policy, as part of its strategic policy against India, and refusing to change its stance. Ever since 1999 Kargil War, India has been changing the terms of engagement. In Kargil War, if you remember, Prime Minister Bajpayee then strictly told the armed forces not to cross the LOC. In 2016, when the Uri attack happened, India then crossed the LOC, although the soldiers didn't cross, but there was a strike, surgical strike. In 2019, but the surgical strike was restricted to Jammu and Kashmir, POK, not Jammu and Kashmir, the Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. In 2019, after Pulwama happened, the strike was not just in POK, but in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. Now, this time, it has been widened to even Punjab. So India is giving the message that we are not hesitating. We'll strike anywhere where we think the threats from there lie, whether it is POK, which is, according to Pakistan, a disputed territory, but not according to India, and anywhere else. So the terms of engagement between India and Pakistan has dramatically changed. How do you see that, thing pan out again in the future, and this, in terms of engagement changing? How do you see the equation between India and Pakistan change?
You're absolutely right in pointing out the sequence of how India responded from Kargil 1999 to Op Sindur in 2025. At that time in Kargil, you'll recall that it was said that the Indian military was asked to operate with one hand tied behind its back.
Yeah.
This is when Mr. Vajpayee was Prime Minister. Now, you can see that Prime Minister Modi has gone on record to say that the armed forces have been given freedom to choose whatever kind of response they deem appropriate. And this has been said in public. So I also see this as a kind of signal as far as the India-Pakistan relationship is now concerned. And you're absolutely right in pointing out that the Indian military now has demonstrated its credibility in being able to plan and execute the equivalent of a joint operation, which involves all three armed forces. My own sense is that they would have also used other assets like cyber and space. It may not be in the public domain, but clearly all these have been integrated, and Op Sindur was concluded in a visibly successful manner from whatever reports we have till now. If more data or more information comes up, then of course we may have to revise our assessment. But this is going to be the new normal, where Pakistan will try and escalate and again draw the attention of the international community to say that this is the most dangerous point. We are the smaller country, we are a victim, and if we are pushed to the wall, we'll have no option but to look at our nuclear capability. The moment that particular word is used, then you can see, and legitimately the international community, which really doesn't understand very much of what is happening here in terms of the complexity. You say that this problem goes back to October 1947. Most people will say that our grandparents were not born at that time or our parents were not born. So, memories about this part of the world are very short and they are broad brush. And again, this is something that we should ponder over in a very objective and candid manner, which is that in as much as India projects itself as having been a victim of jihadi terrorism since the early 90s, when Mr. Narasimha Rao was the Prime Minister, and that Pakistan is the state sponsor, it's not seen in such a black and white manner by the rest of the international community. Even now, despite the fact that India and the United States are now in a partnership, a robust partnership, there are well-wishers for Pakistan and what it did for the United States, going back to Mao Zedong and Nixon and all those openings that Pakistan provided, the role it played in the Cold War, the role it played during the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, and the fact that Pakistan was the conduit for Osama bin Laden when he was on the American side fighting against the Soviets. So, there is an empathy, there is a history, which is why many Indians are upset, angry that, say, BBC, for instance. Even this morning, I heard this myself, the early morning bulletins used the word gunmen when it came to describing the April 22 Pelgam terror massacre.
For whatever editorial reason, doesn't want to use the word terrorist for whatever reason.
Yeah,
because
absolutely. So I'm saying India has to be aware of this fact that when we look at what is going to happen from now on, China is squarely supporting Pakistan. We have to factor that in. Turkey is providing military assistance. So all I'm trying to suggest is that this is going to be a complex challenge for India. How do you prevail upon the Pakistani army to desist from supporting terror groups? On current evidence, it appears that General Munir is still invested in keeping these groups because for him there are multiple options. He also has to consider using them in Afghanistan. By the way, that's another interesting observation that after Pelgam, when the massacre took place, even the Taliban in Kabul had condemned it, that particular attack.
Yeah, true.
To me, that was, I thought, a significant kind of a development. But Pakistan is not alone, in as much as India likes to think that the whole world sees it as a sponsor of terrorism of the jihadi variant. I think it's a very gray, it's not black and white. And we in India, I think, have to see this as one of the lessons of the outcome of Op Sindur. How do we ensure conventional deterrence, to prevent another Pahalgam? Because Pulwama followed by Balakot did not prevent Pahalgam in 2025. We have to do an internal review, starting from the lapses that led to the Pahalgam massacre. After all, there were intelligence lapses.
Absolutely.
We've had some material inadequacies. Maybe our surveillance was not up to speed despite all the technology. So this homework has to be done here.
Yeah. I'm glad earlier wars that China was not that invested in those wars. We talk of Western support, Gulf support, Turkish support. For the first time, China was at least a factor in the war, and China's weapons systems and platforms were widely used. Their planes were used. In fact, since you are a military analyst, many military experts talked about this was actually a war between European systems, largely French, which the Indians used, French, Israeli, Russian, and indigenous, of course, and versus Chinese systems and Turkish systems. So, how did you see in terms of the weapons, the missiles, the aircraft that were used? There were reports that Rafales were shot down by J-10C planes and PL-15 missiles and etc. So, how did you see this? The rivalry between the two systems, the
I think
Chinese.
first of all, purely from a military point of view, I would say that this particular conflict between India and Pakistan saw a new level of the delivery of ordnance, to use the jargon, meaning both sides were using trans-border capabilities, which is to say they were staying within their own borders or in their own countries, not crossing the line of control.
Across the LOC or border.
Yeah, but using platforms that could deliver ordnance. It's a bit like saying that I have an aircraft that can stay 100 miles away from the border and fire a missile that has a range of 200 kilometers. So I can pick up targets in a radius of 80 kilometers, to put it very simplistically. Drones were used in a big way. We do not have the exact numbers, but hopefully the battle damage estimates will all be available soon. If not here, there's enough satellite kind of coverage that will provide this. And we would have a better sense about how many drones and in which manner. There have been some reports that suggested that they were used in the hundreds by Pakistan, but I would hold my breath and wait for the numbers to come. But definitely, many of them of Turkish origin have been reported. I've seen stray reports about Chinese equipment, but as I said, let us wait for the accurate data to come. But they are talking of, yes, China does cooperate with Pakistan for manufacturing and providing or producing the Chinese-based fighter aircraft. Was it used? If so, in which manner? Did China provide any intelligence? When we talk about ISR, which is the new kind of availability of the air picture, today technology allows you to sit in a place as far away as you can imagine, thousands of kilometers away, and have the complete tactical picture and share it with whichever platform you want, whether it's the command or it's the specific fighter aircraft or the controllers and so on and so forth. Again, there are stray reports which have not been verified that China has provided this. But I'd be very hesitant to accept it because China is always very cautious. As in the case of Ukraine, it may provide a certain amount of assistance. But getting directly involved in the tactics of the war.
These planes and missiles were widely used. This is in report.
So we'll have to see about this. But these are two factors: that one, technology, other, Pakistan's ability to obtain support of this type is going to be a new challenge for India.
I mean, it is difficult to talk about the Indo-Pakistan relationship in the future and how it will pan out. But I remember, a former foreign minister, Natwar Singh, who was also a high commissioner to Pakistan in the 80s, once talked to a group of editors saying that India-Pakistan relationship is one of the most accident-prone relationships in the world. And this holds, this hold has been holding good in terms of descriptive, in terms of India and Pakistan for a very long time. Just when things seem to be going all right, something happens and the things, go off track. Now, how do you see the future? Because India has said that there is no question of a face-to-face meeting yet. It's too premature. Pakistan is keen to have direct talks and a dialogue with US mediation. US has given its good offices and talked about neutral thing. So how do you, as an analyst, see the picture? I mean, these are just guesses. 3 months from now or 6 months from now, how do you see various scenarios?
One of the more positive kind of scenarios that one would like to envision we know what the negative consequences of more Pahalgam-like incidents and more of Sindur kind of responses will lead to a higher spiral of death and destruction, which I think South Asia can do without. Meaning that if you see what is happening in Ukraine now, or you see what is happening in the Middle East in terms of Gaza, Palestine, or you see parts of Africa where these long festering wars, for instance, in Sudan and Congo, elsewhere, are playing out, the heaviest price is paid by the most vulnerable. And South Asia is characteristic of human security in indicator rather of human security in South Asia is very, very below the median. It's of a low order. You don't want to add to their misery with wars because of decisions taken by the leadership. So to that extent, we do not want to go down that path as a region, as South Asia. The more positive interpretation would be, and I say this, maybe tentatively, that both sides have to consider delinking their bilateral from the domestic political compulsion, or even the domestic power compulsion in the case of Pakistan, because the army has appropriated a certain amount of unbridled power unto itself. And that is not domestic politics, that is just domestic power grabbing. In the Indian case, we have seen that over the last 10, 15 years, domestic political compulsions have in a way colored or tempered the way in which India has been dealing with Pakistan in particular. So I think I know that's the sad part. That's the sad part. I think that is the acknowledgement we need also here about, do we want to continue this kind of uneasy relationship with the border being hot with Pakistan, an uneasy relationship with China where Galwan has become the symbol? Or is it possible that we are able to rewire the politics? And that's where I think Prime Minister Modi, given his own profile and his relationship with the global leadership, whether it is President Putin or the king in Saudi Arabia, elsewhere, that whether it's possible to have these quiet dialogues without commitments and away from any kind of possible domestic backlash and get stakeholders. I mean, we need more peacemongers, if one can use that word, and find especially the younger generation. And if I could end this on a personal note, Tarun, both you and I are grandparents, and we are looking at a generation that may inherit a very, very, I would say, bleak kind of landscape. And that is something that the generation in between, those who are in their 20s and 30s, should become aware of the positive possibilities, the potential of this region, and see how the domestic politics and the domestic framework can be shaped for this long-term objective.
You're so right, Uday. While we are all relieved at the ceasefire that came into effect last evening, but it looks somewhat fragile, but it has held. But the times are uncertain. The future is still very, very uncertain. And I mean, as to quote Natwar Singh again, accidents can happen all the time between India and Pakistan, in a diplomatic way, in a military way, in a non-state actor intervention, or anything can happen. So, but as you say, the future lies with the young, and there are peace groups in India, in Pakistan, the younger generation, a lot of them outside India, who are deeply invested in peace and stability and want that the two countries live together and in harmony and communal and international bilateral stability. So with this hope, I think the next time we talk again, we hope that we'll have more positive things to talk about the relationship. But right now, thank you for the conversation. And I think we are able to give a little bit of insight and peek into what happened in the last tumultuous weeks. And, we keep our fingers crossed for a better future for the people of the two countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Tarun. Thank you.